Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas was a good old boy from Yakima, Washington in the Pacific Northwest. He was on the court longer than any other justice, issued the most opinions and dissents, and authored 32 books. He was also threatened with impeachment more than any justice. Douglas was an environmentalist, civil libertarian, defender of the First Amendment and the right to privacy. Throughout his life, he was an avid hiker, outdoorsman, mountain climber, and nature lover. He summited most of the mountains in the Cascades. His nickname was Wild Bill. Our guest today has hiked many of the same trails as Douglas, admired the man, and even wrote a book about him. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings, everybody. We've got another podcast today, and this is going to be a fun one because I met a friend that I've known for, 30, 40 years. Mentioned that I was doing a podcast. He said, I wrote a book. And I said, come on our podcast. So that's why we're here. So from a Safeway store to our podcast, we're welcoming Tom Hulst. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, guys. Really great to be here.
And I have known Tom since I moved to the Pacific Northwest in the 80s, like 1979, 1980. And Tom was an educator, and he was my superintendent. As I was a school psychologist, and Tom was the superintendent of schools in Peninsula School District, and went on to become a policy wonk for Dan Evans in the state government. We have Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, which is runs our school system at the state. Worked there for a time, and ended up becoming a political scientist, teaching at a few college classes here and there. And there you go. Did I miss anything, Tom?
No, that's thank you. Yeah, that's right.
When I knew Tom as a superintendent, he was always walking around with a book. Every week he'd have a different book, and it was always very eclectic, and it'd have something to do with politics or history or law or whatever. And that's how I remember you, Tom, as just quite a free spirit and intellectual. And I'm assuming that you still have that you have that disease in you right now, right?
Well, it's hard to compare with you guys. I mean, you were talking about books that I got to check that out. You had a book on injustices and all these books just in the stuff that I saw, and the Powell memo, and I had to go back to do more research. But yeah, I guess I have a wide range of reading that I like to do in policy and law and environment and social justice.
Yeah.
Education.
Your book is The Footpaths of Justice William O. Douglas, and it's a legacy of place. And I didn't know much about William O. Douglas. Greg did. Greg knew. Yeah, I know.
Oh, okay.
He was spouting off all about him, but this is, I guess, the book is not an it's not a biography of William O. Douglas. It's kind of this eclectic mix of your life, your love and passion for hiking, and also your love and passion for government and the law and Supreme Court. And I don't know, you describe it.
No, the word eclectic has been used before, Pat. And yeah, a lot of people who read it before I wrote it said, Tom, take out that memoir part. And actually, I had read Winter Brothers by Doig, if you read any of Doig at all.
No.
And he's quite a writer from Montana, written a lot of books, just died recently. But in Winter Brothers, he goes to Port Townsend and retraces kind of the life and steps of a guy named Swan, who was there in 1853. And Swan was a teacher, he was a pioneer, he was a farmer, one of those Renaissance guys who lived in Washington Territory in the 1850s. And Doig sort of followed his life, 150 years later. And so I kind of followed that format, except I basically retraced Douglas's steps and his trails pretty much around the Pacific Northwest, and found it fulfilling. So there's this kind of linkage between policy, prose, and place, or word and wilderness. There's a lot of ways to describe kind of that. But Douglas was a unique character who was a Washingtonian, and I read a little bit of his jurisprudence when I was in graduate school, and a little bit even as an undergrad, but didn't think much of it. Back in those days, he wrote an article in Playboy, and just like Carter, took a lot of criticism for writing in Playboy. But he said, I wanted to reach the minds of the young, and so he wrote it. And so I was slightly aware of Douglas just as a student, but I really became much more interested when I realized that he took his love of hiking in the outdoors through political action to actually public policy. And that's kind of the chain of events. So someone, just to give you an example, in the chapter on the C&O Canal is a good example, and that's on the East Coast. So the C&O Canal was the old C&O Canal, 350 miles long, that ran during the 19th century and had all these locks, and the canal boats would run along being pulled by mules. Well, by our century, or the last century, that canal just was lying there, and people would use the towpath recreationally. But the Washington Post wrote an article, and I tell this story in the book. The Washington Post wrote an article and said, we should pave that over. It should be a parkway. And Douglas and Brandeis and others used that recreationally for years. And he said, anyone that thinks that should be paved over should walk with me the entire distance. And the entire distance of the canal then was 180 miles. And so the Washington Post editors actually joined Douglas on that hike, and so did a lot of wilderness luminaries. This was in 1954. And at the end of that hike, 100,000 people, this was on a newsreel, 100,000 people came out to Georgetown, where the canal ends there at Lock 1. 100,000 people came out, cheered Douglas and the other hikers. And the Washington Post said, we withdraw our support of a parkway through there. And later it became a national park. And now it's 10th in the nation on the attendance as a national park. And people can go out there in the winter. They can ice skate on the canal. They can bike ride. And if you ever get a chance to go to DC, you should go 5, 10, 15, 20 miles up that canal. Anyway, that was an example of what Douglas did. So in our own state, he did a similar walk along the Pacific Beach, which is now a wilderness area. He did the same thing at Glacier Peak Wilderness. And he did these things all over the country by a couple of other biographers and I. Adam Sowards is one, and Judge McCune on the Ninth Circuit, who just wrote a book called Citizen Justice, a biography. We all agree that through his activism, he probably saved something like 32 areas for national parks and wilderness areas. And so those things really they intrigued me, that a guy sitting on the high court could have, I guess I can't use the word balls, to step out of his robes and be a citizen activist on behalf of the environment.
Yeah, you can definitely use the word balls. The back to the knee. Everybody knows Highway 101 snakes up all through the coast. And if you don't know Washington State, when you get into Washington State, Astoria, all of a sudden it's that big loop around the Olympic National Park, which is wild. I mean, I think the first white man traversed the Olympic National Mountains in 45 or something.
That's right.
And they wanted to put a major freeway through the whole thing and literally destroy this, probably the longest pristine area of water, ocean front in the country. And he did exactly what you said with the canal. He said, he got in his white Mercedes, he organized hikes. He took people on this area and said, this is valuable, deserves to be saved, and he saved it.
That's right. That's exactly right, Pat. And the same story, again, it's one of the 32 areas or something. Truman had bought that strip. Well, Roosevelt in 37 created the Olympic National Park. And then Truman, give him credit, bought that strip along the coast, which is about 60 miles. And it runs from Ozette all the way down to the Hoh River there. And so, but that was just sitting there. And like you said, a group wanted to pave that over, the highway department and others, because we wanted to be like Oregon, and have this beautiful coast that we can drive in our automobile. And Douglas said, shouldn't there be some places that are saved as wilderness that you can only get there by walking? And so he did. There was a hike in 58. So 4 years after the C&O Canal hike in 58, he led the same luminaries. And you can get a movie of that on YouTube, of that hike. And then he did it again in 64 because there was still interest in as late as 64. But finally, after the 2 hikes, he was successful along with others in getting that declared wilderness. And so now, and I don't know if you've done that hike, but I'll tell you, talk about a pristine walk. That's the other thing we should do when you come out here, Greg, is take you out to Third Beach. And it may be a little bit like Maine or the East Coast, but I'll tell you, it's rough coastline. You get a feeling of what it's like on the West Coast Trail on Vancouver Island, which is one of the top 50 hikes in the world. But we have that here in Washington State, thanks to Douglas.
Is that the one that you have to worry about the tides coming in and out as you're doing your hikes? And
yeah, you have to have a tide chart. We slept one night. We had the chart and we thought we were fine, but it came within about three feet of our sleeping bags.
Greg, are you a hiker?
I'm a walker, but I have a question for both of you. I mean, what fascinates me is, I approached Douglas from a political perspective. I was a youngster.
Sure. Oh, cool.
I thought he was the greatest thing in the world because he's iconoclastic. He was a supporter of civil rights.
Yes.
He was a First Amendment absolutist. When I was a college student, I thought that was the cat's meow. I mean, someone that believes in the absolute universality of the right to free speech. And of course, that's not a popular judicial position. It hadn't been since the fire in a movie theater example.
Yeah.
But he was an absolutist. And I listened to this. I didn't know he was such an environmentalist. I knew he was an environmentalist, but I didn't know he was a hiker. But this view of the world that he had, I'm trying to connect that with his universalism, his absolutism about civil rights. I don't know if it goes back to the U.S., the mythology of the Wild West. I don't know what it goes back to. Do you have any thoughts about that?
That's such a great question, and you described him very well. And I'm afraid when I first read his opinions as a college student, I wouldn't describe myself as an absolutist. I've kind of moved that direction more now. So it's interesting that you were intrigued by his jurisprudence then, as we all should be now. But yet he grew up in Yakima, Washington. So the story about Douglas having polio, now one of his biographers said no, it really wasn't polio, and he built that up and played that up because of Roosevelt's polio. But Douglas had an infantile sickness that made him very, very, very sick, and he saw himself as very puny in grade school, and so he would walk. Someone said, if you strengthen your legs, you'll build yourself up and be strong. And so he started walking around Yakima, and then he gradually walked from Yakima. You haven't been in Yakima, Greg, but Pat has. If you walk from Yakima, then across the Natchez River, the first hill there is called Sela Gap, and it's maybe 900 feet up. It's a big hill that rings the city of Yakima. And he walked up that hill, and then gradually he walked from Yakima all the way into the Cascade Mountains, which was, 30, 40, 50 miles. And as a teenager, he would walk miles and miles and miles from when he was 12, 13 years old all the way until he went to Whitman College. And so he became also, he was an English major at Whitman College, and he became really interested in John Muir, read all of John Muir's works, and Aldo Leopold was a big fan of Leopold, and many other wilderness writers. So he kind of linked his passion for hiking in the wilderness to public policy of Muir. And so then I think that, and he says in Go East, Young Man is one of his biographical works. And then the other one that it was a bestseller is called Of Men and Mountains.
He wrote 30. How many books?
I say 32, and I have all of them. Others say he wrote more, but it depends on whether you call some of the lectures that he gave and some of the other things in small, almost pamphlets, whether you call them a book or
The Wild Men, Of Men and Mountains, The Court Years,
yeah,
Beyond the Himalayas,
Beyond the Himalayas, right?
Citizen Justice, Letters of Douglas, Strange Lands, Friendly People, Russian Journey. He wrote a lot.
Do you know that? Or are you reading from something?
I'm going to splash that up on our screen. I went through and just captured a few of his books off Amazon, and I couldn't believe how many he wrote.
Yeah, that's right. No, he was prolific. And by the way, I'll just add for you guys, a lot of this stuff I did because it's a hiking book, and I was, like you said, I was thinking as I was walking on the trails. But to spend time in his papers in the manuscript division at Library of Congress is unbelievable. It's unbelievable because you go in there and they have his 1,200 Supreme Court opinions, Greg, along with his dissents. He wrote the most opinions anybody on the court, as well as the most dissents of anyone on the court, including the Dennis case about communists. If you may remember, maybe read that case on the First Amendment. Yeah, you probably will.
That was a very bold thing to do at the time in '51.
Very courageous with McCarthyism and anti-communism running. It was very bold.
For me, that was a measuring stick of absolutism. If you believe in free speech, you believe in free speech.
That's right.
Even in case of Nazis and Cicero, it's free speech. It's absolute. I've modified my views since then. I think basically most of the people that advocated accepting him, most of the people that advocate free speech are really hypocrites. I mean, I don't think they really believe in it. They believe in it when they want to believe in it,
right?
As they did in the McCarthy era, and as they're doing today. I mean, we don't have. Yeah. How can you have free speech today when you have media domination by with money? But he believed in it. He really believed in it. I'm wondering if maybe this West Coastism, this idea of hiking, of open spaces, of having room around you. Don't bother me. This is my space. Don't interfere with it. That concept of right, which was one of my PhD dissertation questions. That concept flows out of being people not bumping into each other, people having room, allowing for other people.
That's so Douglassian, Greg. That is absolutely on target. That you hit it. That's right. He believed in a marketplace of ideas. So whether it's in the academy or on the street, and it all related to you put it so well, open spaces, openness of mind, openness of spaces, and that's why I tied it into a sense of place or a sense of space. I think the linkage between the environment and intellectual freedom or intellectual freedom and bodily freedom to go anywhere, wilderness, all those things tie together. It's a powerful concept that we lose sight of today.
Do you think there are any advocates? Are there any I mean, are there people in public in public eye today that are Douglassonian? I mean, is there anyone that you see and admire that you think keep that tradition alive?
There's not very many, and I'll tell you, you'll be interested in this too. There's a guy who, and you guys will be honorary members. There's a group called the Pacific Northwest William O. Douglas Society.
Right.
And let me just put a word in there about that. Now, you guys will be honorary members as of today. Kathy Douglas was his last wife, and he met her in a bar. Douglas met, and he was a bit of a womanizer. He met her in a bar in Oregon when she was 25, 26. He was in his 60s, and they married. Well, Kathy, he kind of put her through law school. She got through law school by studying in his place in Goose Prairie, Washington, and then of course later he died in 1980. But Kathy Douglas became a very excellent lawyer in her own right in Boston, remarried, has children, and then became president of the Supreme Court Literary Society. And so she invited a guy by the name of Mike Hoagie, Pat, who is the attorney for Seattle Public Schools back in the day.
Goodness.
Then he went to work for Perkins Coie, And he argued and won a Supreme Court case before the United States Supreme Court. Well, he was just like you, Greg, and I. He was a Douglas devotee because he grew up in Yakima. Mike did. He ended up buying the Douglas cabin in Goose Prairie. So a bunch of us went back for the 75th anniversary. Kathy Douglas invited a bunch of us for the anniversary of his appointment to the court by Roosevelt, 75 years before. And we went into the court, and Lawrence Tribe was there speaking, and all these luminaries and clerks from the justice and law school professors and East Coast luminaries, and even Chief Justice welcomed us, and we had a drink with Justice Breyer out in the veranda later. And so they said, well, this will be the last time we honor Justice Douglas. And Mike Hoagie and I said, not in your life. We're going to continue his legacy in the Pacific Northwest. So we created this Pacific Northwest William O. Douglas Society. And we meet in Goose Prairie and at the museum in Yakima. In fact, we just had a major Douglas Award dinner. We gave Sally, former Secretary of the Interior, what's your last, Sally, the Douglas Award, the first Douglas Award. And we have an essay contest. So that's not a very good answer to you. I would say there's very few people, like, if any, quite like Douglas, who had that platform, who had his ideas and his guts in terms of whether he wrote a book or he went all over the country to save these precious areas. Another one, I went and did a book talk myself down in Arkansas on the river down there, the Buffalo River. And as a result of his canoe trip and his hike and his talk down there, if you can imagine, in the Deep South, that was the first national river added to the national river system. So, there's all these stories about the Red River. He did the same thing in the Red River. So no, there isn't anybody quite like him. And that's why I try to keep that legacy alive, whether it's writing or thanks to you guys getting on your program here.
The Prairie Goose cabin, which he built, or
Goose Prairie, yes.
Goose Prairie, I have a picture of it. They said he would go there frequently to either write or entertain girlfriends or wives or whatever. But
yes, that's right.
There was one story. I don't know if that was in your book, but it might have, as I was doing background on this podcast.
Yes.
With the Cambodian bombing, if you remember, Richard Nixon was bombing.
Yes. That's
Cambodia,
right.
and he shouldn't have been, and it was illegal, and he was dropping more bombs in Cambodia than all World War II. It was just a couple of pilots, had problems of just daily doing carpet bombing, and they kind of were wanting to refuse. It came to the Supreme Court, and they decided should they have a cease and desist for the Nixon bombing. So the ACLU apparently had him on speed dial call and tracked him down with his fourth wife. He's 67, she's 23, and they're out at Goose, at the lodge in Yakima.
That's right.
And they said, "Would you please, do a cease and desist?" He meets him at the cabin, and gruff as hell. He was mean to his clerks. He was a gruff old.
He was gruff.
He was gruff, and he said, "All right, just put it there and come back in an hour or two." And he wrote the brief to have in court the next day. Came back, he had nailed it to a tree because he went off hiking. And then he met him the next day. They did the cease and desist. They eventually, stopped it for a while, but then lost it. And then eventually Nixon created his own problems, and it all worked out in the end. There are hundreds of stories like this of his eccentricities.
That's right.
And
Pat, you're actually mixing two stories but one is he was out hiking up in the Goat Rocks Wilderness, and these two lawyers came up in their street shoes and got to him and presented their case at the campfire. And he said, "Well, I need to think about this overnight." So this wasn't the bombing case; it was another case.
Okay.
And he said, "I need all night to think about this, so I'll see you tomorrow." They said, "What?" we hiked all the way in here. We want you to make a decision. No, I'll let you know tomorrow. So they hiked all the way out, came all the way back in the next day, and he was gone. And all it was a piece of paper with a stick in a log, and it said denied. And so that was it. So, but the other case, which was the bombing case, yeah, he famously dictated that decision to stop the bombing from he heard the case in Yakima, actually. They had all the attorneys, everyone arrived in the courthouse in federal courthouse in Yakima. And he drove back to Goose Prairie, which is about 40 or 50 miles. And he stopped at the in those days at the pay telephone at the lodge there, and because he didn't have a telephone in Goose Prairie. And he dictated over the telephone his opinion to stop the bombing in Cambodia in 1970.
I'll be done.
And then so they call that the Douglas telephone. And we're actually looking, the pinwads are actually looking for that telephone right now, because it's kind of it should be in the National Register. He did that a number of times, but he dictated that decision over the telephone. And then of course the court came together as a court and overruled Douglas just a few days later. So the bombing continued, as you said.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, there are lots of stories like that.
Oh man. And he grew up in Yakima and picked cherries with the migrant workers. And
Yes.
so he developed a sense of, esprit de corps with this population of people that would come and travel to and from. They'd come from Mexico, they'd go back to
workers.
Mexico. Yeah, migrant workers.
And the Wobblies, I do write about that as a page or so early in the book. He really had a heart for the Wobblies and the Workers of the World group in the early 1900s that were loggers and orchard workers and all the rest. And he would spend time with the Wobblies. So I think Greg, that's the other thing that influenced his jurisprudence later, is he never lost sight of his beginning, or never lost sight of the poor people that he remembered, as a young kid underneath the bridges in Yakima along the rivers, and people just getting by.
He used to drive his rivals and his contemporaries crazy that he wouldn't play the judicial game, and that game is one of precedent. So if you're going to have an opinion, and certainly on the Supreme Court, that's the most important opinion you can have, you're supposed to draw upon the precedents. You're supposed to delve deeply into English common law and all historical precedents and all the judicial findings of the past, and somehow locate your opinion. And he tended to locate his opinion based on social justice.
That's right.
And that was something that was kind of a gut thing with him, though he could support it. He could support why it was rational, why it was the thing to do, why it was consistent with anyone's sense of fairness and justice. But that drove him crazy, because that's not the way they saw the judicial system as operating. And of course, today we're back to a time when everybody sees it in terms of precedents and the past decisions and so forth. So I remember I tried to find this before we went on. I couldn't find it in my old collection of Evergreen reviews. I don't know if you know what Evergreen Review was, but Grove Press was a famous publishing house in America. I think Lady Godiva's Lover and a few other breakthrough magazines, books that challenged censorship in this country. They were published by Grove Press, and Grove Press put out Evergreen Review. And I'm a young high school kid and rebellious, so I get a subscription. And there's an issue which is about Douglas. Either he gave an interview or somehow it connected to it. I tried to find it. I thought you'd enjoy seeing that.
Oh, I would like to see it.
If I dig it up, I have more time.
If you find it, you could email me back, right?
Yeah, I will. I will
I would
indeed.
love to see.
But that was very important for me when I read that story, because it told the kind of story about a person that puts principle ahead of procedure.
Yeah, Douglas famously said, I would rather make a precedent than follow one. And he also famously said, along with Holmes and Brandeis, that I don't want, men, not women, but men long dead should not do our thinking for us. And so, I keep wondering what he would say with the overturning, the not following precedent of Roe here recently in the case out of the abortion case, and also some of these gun cases where they are going, as you said, Pat and Greg, going back to English common law days and the colonial times to dig out. That's part of the originalism now, right? What did the founders really mean? What was the public meaning of what the words mean? It's kind of what originalism is. And Douglas was not he was a great dissenter along with a few others. So he wasn't afraid to spit in somebody's eye, right? And he had more courage, I think, than anybody I'm aware of in public life.
That's why I ask if you know of anyone like him, because it's very different to argue with the originalist and say, well, you don't capture the meaning in 1789, 1793. You don't capture that meaning. We think it meant this, and then no, it meant this. Essentially, most of judicial philosophy today accepts originalism, either in arguing against what originalists say, but he didn't. He didn't think that meant a lot.
That's
As you
right.
said, old men don't hold the truth for today, and no one will say that today. No one that I know of will say that today.
You're right, and
we miss it.
That's such a great. I don't know why that. I mean, Breyer has written a book on a living constitution, and others, and the former and some of the, like Souter and some of the others, finally stood up on the court. But it's hard to find a public. Certainly, somebody running for Congress will never say it, even on the left, right?
No, exactly.
It's just hard to find people who will say that. And I don't know. I'm like you. I don't know what it is. I know I'm not an originalist, I think, and Pat, you had that also as one of your questions. It's kind of like those who view the Bible, as literate and inerrant. It's almost like these old words have something over us, and that we've cathect almost religious, and you study philosophy, Greg, so there's something that we give to some old person's words, and we almost worship them, rather than take them as something to look at and to consider, but it doesn't need to be binding. It doesn't need to be formulaic. That's the word I use. The current court is so formulaic. They just jump to this, to what they think the words mean, rather than an issue of justice. And it's hard for me for people who are really schooled in the law and have a Yale education or a Harvard education, can fall prey to that kind of thinking. I don't get it.
Well, this is Douglasonian. His views, one of his opinions is, well, I don't know if it's an opinion, but he spoke out in defense of nature.
Yes.
He talked about granting rights to things like trees, to things in nature, inanimate objects, if you will.
That's right.
And that's become a popular thing in the last 30, 40 years in rights talk, to award animals rights. Today it's commonplace. But to me, it shows some of the incoherence of rights theory, because if you grant that trees have rights, and then you grant that animals have rights, and you extend this beyond human beings, then you're left. You can't argue against giving a corporation a right, and that's something that the liberals rail against, and the left rails against correctly. But I think it goes to the really basic incoherence of rights theories, that it expands it beyond human beings. What are your thoughts? It seems
that's great. That's great, because I've written articles on the rights of nature that was the Sierra Club versus Morton, when he actually said corporations have been given standing in the famous Chevron case, right? Which was so antithetical to the purpose of the 14th Amendment. Anyway, so he said because corporations have rights, inanimate objects ought to have rights. So he said it the other way. You raise a good point. I think as somebody who cares about the environment, and philosophically to really have integrity, I'd have to sit with you probably and talk about it a lot more before I made up my mind fully. It may be true that it's just human beings who should have rights. We shouldn't extend those to others. But I think Douglas was arguing in the law that that sort of people who have an interest in a river basin, in a mountain, in a meadow, on behalf of the environment should have standing to bring an action. See, in Sierra Club, the Sierra Club was not given standing because no individual was being harmed. So the standing clause of the Constitution didn't apply to them. That's what the case found, that they didn't have standing to sue, to bring an action. So I think Douglas was saying there should be some way that human beings through the environment can have standing, because it's an affront to them. The fisherman or the hunter or the hiker or the climber should have as much right to that public land as the guy that wants oil and shale and something else from it. So that was one of the in our student essay contest, that was one of the subjects of our essay, by the way, in Yakima last year. So it's you raise a great point. I'll leave it there.
Mhm.
Yeah, it reminds me, I was following the Disney wanting to put in the
That was it.
the ski thing, and that just resolved in 2020. And that started back in the, way back before Disney died. I mean, he wanted to, Walt Disney wanted to start this, he died, and they wanted to put into, was it the Sahara Nevadas? Put in a major ski resort.
Yeah.
I
wonder why you're saying it was resolved in the 20. They appended that area to the national park there. Which one?
Well, the Disney Corporation just finally said we're done with it. They're not going to pursue it anymore. It was stopped, but it was stopped just recently. I just read an article about it. They finally said we're done with it. We're not doing anything with it.
Oh, I'll be darned. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
of course, it could be, I got it off the internet, so there you go. You don't know.
Yeah, that must be true.
So
that's right.
But I want to talk about you a little bit, but let's talk about Douglas. I wanted two things about Douglas.
You got 11 minutes, Pat.
Oh, I got plenty of time. So he was out hiking, and he developed some sort of problem and needed to come to a doctor. I don't know, what do you have, a foot problem? You mentioned in your book. And the guy, he looks like he's homeless. He's just absolutely, gruffy and scruffy. And the doctor didn't want to treat him because he thought he was just a vagrant. Then realized that, no, he does have money and he does have means, and he's Supreme Court justice and so forth. And from then, he then takes that experience and he brings it into his legislative philosophy of, wait a second, you can't just treat people like this, whether they have money or don't have money. The rights have to be weighed. I mean, how far off am I that, Professor? What do you say? Is that close?
No, that's right. Yeah, he was on his way to climb Mount Adams on that trip with his boyhood buddies. That was 1948, and his car broke down. I guess he ended up walking in Pasco and got some blisters on his feet and went into the doctor's office. And yeah, he liked to dress like a vagrant, or like a guy that deals with horses, and so he looked and he said, I don't know if we're going to serve the likes of you. And he said, well, on the Supreme Court, we serve paupers, poor people all the time. And he said, well, what makes you, how do you know that? He said, well, I happen to get by there once in a while, or something like that. So yeah, he did have this sense of social justice and equity and concern for the poor, whether, whatever it may be. There's a famous case I did mention in my book that I think about now relative to the gun problem that we seem to have in our country. And it was a lot of municipalities had ordinances and laws against vagrancy. So if someone just thought you were being a vagrant, you could be picked up for vagrancy and put in jail. And so Douglas, in a famous case, wrote the opinion that ruled against that. Now someone could say that's why we have homelessness now.
Right.
On the streets, is because of that case. All of a sudden it slips my mind. I mentioned it in the book, but you haven't violated a crime by just sitting there, drinking a soda pop on the side of the street and doing nothing. But in those days, if they were based on the poor laws of Britain and so on, they had a horrible, horrible history. But Douglas was famous in his ruling in that case. And to kind of get back, if I want to go and sit somewhere and like Thoreau and take in a river or a pond or sit on the mountain, I don't want someone coming and arresting me for vagrancy. But it's an interesting case, and I think it set the stage for you have to commit a crime, and the crime has to be a legitimate crime for you to be put into jail. And so when I think about that with the red flag laws and other kinds of policies, now I think there's some there's some interesting discussion we need to have about some of those things.
Well, I think Douglas would have fit in well with the founding fathers, as they're gloriously called today, as they're worshipped. But he would have fit in, I think, quite well, because their belief in a Bill of Rights, their belief in in freedom, or if you like, expanded rights, was an expansive one that, and they sensed that by breaking away from England, they were expanding the rights of people here.
Yes.
And they saw the expansion of the country and the ability to travel, not travel, but to go and homestead, the yeoman farmer, all of these things as positives. And they were expansive. They opened up more space around people. They gave them more freedom, et cetera, et cetera. And that seems to be where he's more of an anachronism in that sense. He would have fit in very well. In today's world, he wouldn't fit in, I don't think, at all. Do you?
I think, yeah, I've said, and I believe firmly, that on the environment, on jurisprudence, on individual rights, he was at least 3 generations ahead of his time. And I think his voices his voice today might fit in with young, just as they did in the 60s in some ways. But oh yeah, he would not, his views on the court would, in the Federalist Society, his views about the economy, his views about the environment, they're still they're still progressive. If you go back and as I went,
they don't play nice though. They don't play nice.
They don't play nicely. No, that's right.
Well, that was one of the questions I was going to pose to you. Is Greg and I had Tariq Ali on, who wrote a book about Churchill.
Yes.
And he was frustrated that since the Balkan Islands, Churchill is being revisited as this remarkable, great leader that, won the war and had all its integrity. And even on MSNBC a couple of weeks ago, talking about the Ukrainian thing, they bring up Churchill and how he's, we need a Churchill now. And Tariq Ali, being a Pakistani and Brit, said he was a scoundrel. He was horrible. He was a war criminal. I mean, and that the revisiting him with this mythology is just manipulation. Similar how we did with Reagan. Reagan left office. He had horrible ratings, and now Reagan is this, Republican Jesus kind of thing that gets dragged out.
Yeah.
And in reviewing for your podcast, because I didn't know much about Douglas, I've been watching a lot of videos and lectures. He's just pilloried on the Heritage Foundation.
Oh yeah.
Because he is just the worst person ever. And he's got some problems. I mean, he exaggerates, and he was a little bit of a philanderer, and he couldn't keep his story straight. I mean, he was a character. He was a real character. But it's amazing how he is this poster boy for everything that's wrong with our society now, which is just the opposite of what I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to hear what he would say about letting Trump back on Facebook. Let him back on. I mean, free speech, what's the problem? Get over it, have a better argument. So anyway,
that's very, you guys did your homework.
What do you think?
No, that's right, Pat. I could tell you a quick story. He was a womanizer.
Right.
And in fact, I was ready to send my book in to get it published. And I ran into one of his girlfriends who was about my age. So she was like Kathy. She was younger. She's a little bit older than I am. And she said, you know, I have some letters from Douglas. Would you like to read them? And I said, by all means. And they were basically love letters. And so I went to her house. She cooked me dinner and sat there. She brought out this box, sat me in a chair, and here were, you know, a box full of letters, which I think since then she sent to the Library of Congress. I hope she has. And I almost didn't go forward with the book. It was kind of, it was sort of disappointing. I was disappointed. My first reaction was a disappointment. Then as I read through and I read them all, I think he really cared for this woman. They were very well written, a lot of feeling. And he was divorced at that point, so he was not married. But here's a 65-year-old guy in his 60s, whatever he was then, writing to a young woman in her 20s. And he was clearly taken with her. She was an artist. Her art was all over the world. She was a beautiful woman. But it wasn't the picture I have, I guess. You know, I don't see myself, well, maybe I should take that back at 76. Would I do that? But anyway, but the more I thought about it, the more I read them, I said, no, I'm going to go ahead with it, but I'm just not going to deal with any of that in my book. But he was a complex guy. You know, there's no doubt about it. I've met a number of the clerks. A couple of the clerks are members of the Pacific Northwest William O. Douglas Society. One lives here in Paulsbo. And they said he was a taskmaster. He was tough. Occasionally they'd go out afterwards and watch a football game or have a drink, but during the workday, he was very demanding and gruff. And so a lot of stories about the clerks, but most of them admired him tremendously. They admired his jurisprudence. They admired his guts that you were talking about, Greg, and his views, and that he was so hardworking. But he had flaws. He had foibles. And, you know, the society has talked a lot about whether we've over-aggrandized, you know, overstated. But his legacies in the environment, on law, on public policy, just overshadow, I guess. They're so powerful when you take them all together. And when I sat and looked at his writing and his journals, as he was not just an environmentalist, he was a naturalist. If you go into his papers and look at his little books, they're little blue, like blue books when you took in graduate school, but they're little bound little books. And he had such an inquisitive mind about flowers and trees, and he really was a naturalist in his own right. And as I got into his papers, I said, I've never seen anything like this. His tremendous ability to have such great interest in wide areas of writing and influence and so on.
You know, we're well into this podcast and I haven't talked about what I wanted to talk about most, which is you.
Oh boy.
And and you and hiking and how hiking has changed you. I mean, I realize now in reading this book that back when I knew you as a school psychologist and you were my superintendent, you probably went up to Rainier on the weekend and you know, never with Jack Sinclair or you know, or Roy Okamoto or Wes Pruitt or one of your old buddies, all these good people we know. And the question is, when you're hiking, when I'm thinking of Albert Einstein, he said that he got most of his theories from the Volksmarches, where they would do these hikes in the weekend, and that he would hike and it would have his mind float around, and he would talk with his friends. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you think your career success, your intellectual success, your family success was fueled by the remarkable change that came upon you from being in the wilderness, being with friends, going over that next mountain, and having that so integrated into your life?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate that question. Actually, we may be running it. Cut me off at any point, but I think there's a lot to be said for that, and which is why I wrote in the way that I did. And in there somewhere, Pat, I maybe near the beginning, I talked about the power of the environment on learning and the importance of environmental learning on young lives. And so as a parent, I really, I insisted, at least on Father's Day and a few times out of the year, that we get our backpacks on and go hiking as a family. I do think there's now pretty good data from around the world that the environment has an impact on early learning. And as we see kids with these handheld devices all the time and getting interested in guns rather than the outdoors, actually is a passion of mine that I think we can really, and this gets back to your question of what about my education philosophy, is my education philosophy is now tied in with outdoor learning. And I'm so glad to see our legislature considering 50 million for outdoor camps for 5th and 6th graders as a priority, as an environmental priority. I think it's clear to me. One other just anecdote is when I was with the Educational Service District down in Olympia, I actually started what's called the Chehalis Basin Education Consortium, and it's a consortium of 20 school districts. And in the Chehalis Basin, we would take the students out, all grades, starting in the 3rd or 4th, all the way through high school, and they would measure water quality on various aspects of the river, whether it be in Alaska or down in Aberdeen and Hoquiam or whatever. They would measure the water quality, 10 characteristics of water quality, and they would report that to the UW and the Department of Ecology. So they're engaged in real science. And then while they're on the river, they would do natural science, and they would study the river and wildlife and so on. So they would engage in further science study, and then they would journal. So they would gain their English, and they would take pictures and draw. And so they would be engaged in art. So really a cross-curricular environmental study. And those students would put those photographs and their drawings in the newspaper. So they would actually get to see their own work publicly in the Daily Olympian or the Chronicle from Centralia. So my hiking, I think, in sort of reading Douglas, it did influence my educational philosophy. I've seen through the research and also in my own experience in the Chehalis Project, and then with E3 Washington, the Environmental Education Association of Washington, which I chaired for 4 or 5 years, just the power of this kind of learning on young kids. And I think it's more important than ever that adults realize that they've got to get kids outdoors. I rambled a little bit, maybe got away from your question, Pat, but
no, I mean, you're answering the question. You've got 3 kids,
yes,
and you would drag them on these hikes, and look at these 3 kids. They're remarkable. Your oldest son's done McKinley. All of your kids are into the outdoors, are all healthy, and partially because of the impact of these hikes, the exposure to the outdoors, forcing them at some time to do that.
yeah,
But it's not just, it's just not a pretty mountain. It's also something that changes people, that changes how they view the world, changes how they view people, changes how they might respond to that freeway that's going through the woods or whatever. So
the other, just to add to the other passion I have right now, and I tell my colleagues, I said, we have failed in teaching civics. I teach political science, civics, and I get into these constitutional things that we've discussed here in great detail, as well as Plato's allegory of the cave. And I say we failed in teaching civics. January 6th is ample proof of that. And so I think that the environment and early learning with kids outside teaches stewardship, which leads to citizenship and civic engagement. I honestly believe there's a sequence of events there that we can have a great impact on learning and policy and citizenship if educators would just realize it. That's why I'm really proud of our governor and others who are putting these this 50 million for outdoor camps and so on together. That we have got to integrate those things into student learning, or we may lose our country. That's how passionate I feel about it.
Well, Sammy's just, I do daily walks through Point Defiance. Do you know about Sammy?
They're doing it. Yes, they have visited
It's
there, and I'm
one of
so
the
proud of
one
our
of the most
district.
remarkable high schools in the country, and it's just right
Exactly
here.
right, Pat. Exactly right. Right here. Yep. Yep.
And people are fighting to get into that high school.
Yes. No,
And
I'm so proud of Tacoma for doing that.
when I was doing all the numbers and data regarding Sammy, Science something Math Institute. Anyway, they it's an outdoor school. Equal proportion of poverty, ethnicity, all the demographics are a perfect representation of the local school district here, and yet the graduation rate, academics, it's an outdoor school. They teach. You can do a 2-week course on fly fishing. A friend of mine teaches it. And,
yeah, that's great. And then the fact that they actually tied it. This is a great example where the school district and the Parks Department of the city of Tacoma all partnered to actually create that building there. It's one thing to have them there in tents and walking around the park. It's another thing to invest the way they did to build that school there. It's remarkable. It's a great story. I thought at the beginning, when we talked about how long we'd known each other, I just wanted to say that as I was thinking, when I met you at Safeway and we were communicating and then we were getting ready for this podcast, I was thinking about some of those days back in the 80s and late 80s maybe, and thinking about Pat, Greg. He was not just a good professional, but I thought about his great reports to the board, not just on test scores and achievement scores, but on assessment. Remarkably well done. I always look forward to those, and he did such a great job. But then he did on his own, came to me one time and said, I think, why don't we do, I call it a downstream study, Pat, but you took the initiative to call all those parents and all those kids to find out what these graduates were doing 5 years down the road.
Right.
And I still have one of those studies right here behind me in my bookcase, because I think that provided meaning on what we were doing Peninsula, of course, is a pretty high income, high demographic area. So you'd expect most of the kids to go to college, but it was much higher than the national average, as I remember your work there, Pat, at either community college or four-year schools. But the other thing I just have to say is what Linda and I were talking about the other day. What we really appreciated and enjoyed were Pat's Christmas letters.
Oh God,
those were something to behold. I don't know if you kept any of those. I think we should do a podcast.
The Christmas pictures for years. My son would write the letters. Kevin, who's down in Columbia right now. Actually, just found out that he's getting married. He proposed to his beautiful fiance down there, and now my oldest son Sean has taken over the tradition. I'll have to send you this year's if I don't have it.
I'd love to see it. Oh, that's great. So they inherited your humor and
they got a little bit of that. Hey, let's just tie up with saying, how screwed up are things with our court? How bad is it with the new conservative majority? Is Brett Kavanaugh going to have any impact for the fact that he's such a scoundrel in this Sundance documentary that says that he's absolutely cruel? He is.
Have you seen it?
No, but
you read about it. Yeah, I read about it.
And apparently the smoking gun is they have a lot of phone calls and a lot of reports to the FBI of people, desperately expressing that he was, it's one thing just to be, drunk and aggressive. It's another thing to go into the bathroom and try to create an erection so you can come in and assault some girl with your penis. I mean, it's that level of depravity, that level of, that goes beyond fraternity prankster stuff to a new level of pathology that apparently this documentary very clearly has multiple cases of his deviance, very much of deviance.
Yeah, when I saw that the other day, we went down there one time. We went skiing and went to the festival, and I really want to see that. I'm very, very concerned about the court. As I said earlier, I think it's sort of the Federalist Society is so influenced their thinking, and it's so narrow. And then I think they get like Alito in the abortion case. The tone of that is really upsetting. If you had a chance to read any of it.
I did. I did. Yeah.
They're sort of backed into a corner. It's like they're very defensive about being originalists,
Right.
And they come out and snipe and snark and so on the other justice. They say that, oh, we get along so well in the court, it's family. And you read their writing and you know that can't be true. And so I think if you take 3 or 4 of those justices just have serious personal problems, as you pointed out.
Right.
And then it shows up in their writing, in their jurisprudence. I'm very concerned for the next 15, 20 years of this court.
The Bremerton case, where they literally made up facts.
Yeah.
Where Alito said that there's no suggestion these kids were felt coerced to come and pray at the 50-yard line at the high school football game, when the data suggests they exactly did say that.
Exactly right.
I mean, the fact
exactly
that they could get that so wrong when it's all right there strikes me as kind of, I don't know. What do you think, Greg? Is it all going to hell? How bad is it?
Greg, let's hear from you.
I've never believed that they were above politics.
Yes,
so
right.
I'm not surprised that the corruption comes out, the political corruption, the intellectual corruption comes out. It's much easier for me in my time in my life, looking back, reflecting on my 75 years, to just simply conclude that the elites in this country are corrupt. There's battle around secrets with Trump, Pence, and Biden. Well, they've been stealing these things forever for the libraries. Obama, they all do it. And so I don't get worked up about any individual. I mean, they're pointing at each other now. Well, you stole these secrets, and you stole. They all do. And I think the notion that there's a mythology around the courts, that the courts have always been, they've all been like Douglas, people of integrity. That's not true. The Warren Court would not have been anything without Douglas, I don't think. I mean, Warren wasn't that big of a deal.
Yeah.
He wasn't that incorruptible. Douglas was incorruptible. Say what you like about him. I may not agree with his views today, as I've grown to disagree with him perhaps, but he was incorruptible. He was an honest intellect. Most of them are. Most of them are opportunists. So I don't get worked up about it. I mean, it's time the American people wake up, and the ball's in their court. The American people have to act now. They can't rely upon lawyers or justices or Democratic politicians or senators or whatever to do it for them. They're not going to do it.
Yeah. In the last PA Times piece I wrote, I think I may have sent that to you, but most of it's quotes.
I have it right here. It was the Supreme Court Jurisprudence and the Bill of Rights, Part 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And most of it's you actually have, most of it's a quote. I don't have it in front of me. Most of it's a quote, when I quote in both those, the gun case and the abortion case. In the gun case, Justice that wrote the case, goes back into history and back into British times and so on, and then it says that they bear arms was used then, and they had a right to do that, and he did all that history, and then Breyer says actually scholars and historians have, I think if you have it there, a number of 100,000 writings or something, Pat, it's a huge number, would say that 99% of the time bear arms was used in a military context.
Yeah, back in 1475, historical use of the phrase bear arms, they conclude the phrase is overwhelmingly used to refer to war soldering. So you search for 120,000 found extra texts from the series. So
so there you go.
Not playing fair. I mean,
I rest my case.
Right. Look, guys. Look, I mean, the reality is that we've created a society in which it's a political issue now. It's not a judicial issue.
Yes.
You can argue about 100,000 examples from English common law where this is what they meant. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because it's been so politicized that if you stop people from their guns, there's going to be a revolution.
Yeah.
And the question really is, how did we get to this point? How do we
Mm-hmm.
let things get so bad? How did our celebrated political system get us here? And how can we then find answers? I think they have to be radical answers to fix that,
So
because
true.
the courts can't fix it.
Yeah, so
You know,
true.
suppose tomorrow the court loses its mind, this conservative court, and says, okay, we're going to change gun laws in this country. There's going to be a huge uprising,
Yeah.
bigger problems than we have now.
Well, you're a wet blanket, Greg. Jeez, my goodness.
Well, I've hope, a little hope and optimism that people will wake up and again mobilize, take
Yeah.
action themselves, and not rely upon agency.
Hey, I'm going to link to your book, and
Okay.
I'm giving an order for everybody to buy this thing. I mean, I think of all my hiking friends, my brother-in-law, and all of my friends that are avid hikers. My sister hikes. She's all, late 70s. She hikes. By the way, today's her birthday. My oldest sister is born.
Oh, well, happy birthday.
Oh, happy
if she-
birthday, Sharon. And
right.
while Sharon was having her sixth grade or 6-year-old birthday party, my mother went into the hospital and had my her third child. So two sisters have the exact same birthday. So
Oh, I'll
that
be
was a
darned.
birthday present.
Well, happy birthday to.
So
Tom,
anyway, what's so good about
keep
this?
writing, Tom.
Right. It's just really, it's great. It's your family story. It's the outdoors. It's all the hikes that most people in the Northwest, some have been on, and then a little bit of William O. Douglas, who's quite a character. Keep the glue that keeps it all together. So great book, Tom.
Well, I had a ton of fun talking to you guys. There is a table of hikes at the back too, by the way. But
Right.
I so enjoyed you guys, and unbelievable how much homework you do and how much reading you do, and how
Well,
much you knew just in preparation for this. Thank you.
that's my job now.
That's a great work. Great job.
Thanks, Tom.
All
Great
righty.
fun.
Thank you so much.
All
Come
right.
west, Greg.
You come east. I'll come west. You come east.
All right.
Go west, young man.
There's a lot of forestry around here, a lot of hiking trails.
Well, there is.
A
You
lot
know,
of
we went up to Linda and I did go up to the White Mountains. Had a great time.
Good.
No, you can hike all the way to DC from Pittsburgh now.
That's
That
right.
trail
You sure can.
is open
Yeah.
all the way, and so there's a lot of, you can walk up to Laurel Mountain. That's a nice long hike, and you'd like it. You could walk along Laurel Ridge, cross the Pennsylvania Turnpike. I've done that before, not for a long time, but yeah, you ought to come
All right.
out east. You didn't.
All right. Well,
All
maybe Pat, let's go east then.
All right. Hey, thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.